Recently, I was reading the work Islam from the Edge by Richard W. Bulliet, and in this work, he gives an interesting alternative to the mainstream narratives that we often receive and we often get when we study Islamic history. In many of the mainstream narratives that we often use to understand Islamic history, there tends to be a great focus from the center or a very centralized narrative. In fact, this is probably an issue that arises in many studies of history for various different civilizations, not just specific to Islamic civilization. But what this centralized narrative, specifically in the Islamic context, means is beginning the study of Islamic civilization with the study of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, his life, and those of his subsequent companions. Then the expansion of Islamic civilization over the next 100 or so years, and the centralization of power in the Caliphate before the subsequent dissolution and fracture of the Abbasid Caliphate, and then the sacking of Baghdad in 1258. And then after that, the period of fragmentation in the Muslim world, which eventually culminated in the Ottomans reuniting most of the Islamic world, whilst the Safavids reunited Iran and the Mughals conquered India for Islam. And then after that, Europe's colonization of much of the Muslim world, the destruction of the Ottoman Caliphate, the breakdown of the various other empires of the Muslims throughout the world, and the subsequent Western colonialism that took place. And then in more recent modern times, the re-emergence of Muslim activism and the calls to Islamic forms of governance. On the one hand, you have the Islamic interpretation of all that, which views the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and that of the early generations as a kind of golden age. You also have the Orientalist narratives, some which are more skeptical of Islamic history and especially of the transmission of Hadith and of Quran from the early generations. And you also have the other various Orientalist narratives about Islamic history. For example, Muslims were in a golden age for the first 500 or so years, and then after a while they began to decline and stagnate. But all of these narratives, despite the many benefits that they bring, tend to be viewing Islamic civilization, let's say, from the center. They tend to be viewing it in terms of a few key events that have been occurring throughout Islamic history. And it often ignores the view from the edge. It often ignores the view of the countless localities, the countless cities and villages which made up part of the broader Islamic nation, the Ummah, and the subsequent individuals and communities within these smaller localities, how they experienced Islam, how they lived Islam, and how they understood the Islamic faith, how their cultures synthesized with the Islamic faith to give unique expressions to their religion, and how they dealt with day-to-day problems in the context of their faith and also in the context of the cultures which they received from their ancestors before them. It's a really interesting point that Richard W. Bulliet makes, and this impacts the way that he tries to understand the Islamic sciences and a lot of the primary Islamic literature, but most importantly, how those pieces of literature and those texts affected Muslims within their local individualized context and communal contexts. So, for example, when it comes to the narration of certain hadiths and the practical implications that they have, of course, the more Islamic traditionalist narrative may assert that we study the chains of narration, and as long as there's no weaknesses and there's no contradictions, we accept the hadith, and then we analyze the hadith in terms of its fiqh, its jurisprudence, its jurisprudential relevance. And if we can derive rulings from it on a sound basis, on the basis of sound methodology, then we can apply it. And there's all kinds of nuances and there's all kinds of scholarly debate that goes into that discussion. There's, of course, the Western historical method, which on part can be more critical and skeptical, and it will oftentimes assume that many of the instructions given in certain hadiths tend to be forged later on, or they come from more cultural sources and they were back projected onto the Prophet Muhammad. Oftentimes they will seek to find cultural reasons as to why those teachings may have been attributed back to the Prophet Muhammad in the first place. But Richard W. Bulliet takes a really interesting approach, and he says that regardless of whether certain teachings were authentic or not, the fact that they were transmitted and the fact that they were taught to common people who on the whole used to accept these teachings on a more broad level and it was up to hadith specialists or special scholars of jurisprudence or scholars of hadith, to figure out and understand the relevance, applicability, and authenticity of such reports. For the layman, he wasn't interested in such discussions, however. For him, if he heard a hadith about the Prophet Muhammad, regardless of whether it was applicable or not, or authentic or not, if he had good reason to think that the report was correct or authentic because he heard it from his teacher or he heard it from a hadith reciter, and he had no reason to believe that the hadith reciter or the teacher was lying, then he would accept it. And it would affect, first of all, his perception of the Islamic religion, of the Prophet Muhammad, but second of all, it may also affect him practically, how he chooses to live his life, if he chooses to abide by that teaching or not. So for him, it wasn't necessarily the case that he was delving into all of these specialist discussions, but for the individual who heard these rulings within his local context, he would either apply them or not, and it would definitely, at the very least, have a kind of practical effect on his life. And so this view from the edge gives us the perspective not to necessarily understand Islam how an academic or how a specialist or a scholar may understand it or its development, but rather it gives us the perspective of how local communities and how of the average everyday Muslims in these various localities would have practiced Islam, and they would have understood Islam in their everyday lives, regardless of the scholarly discussions that often went behind these things. So that's a really interesting point. And of course, in every kind of history and historical narrative, there is this bias towards the center, or there is this bias towards what the academics or what the great people of those times believed and said and did. And whilst that is obviously important in its own right, I'm not disputing that, it is important to see how these things affected the everyday people, the commoners, because the commoners make up the vast majority of the people who live that experience, who lived through those times. And so you can't just detach yourself from the reality of the commoners in those eras. And so it's really important to take a step back and try and understand how the common people of those times lived by those teachings and by those instructions in their day-to-day lives.